Well, ladies and gentlemen, only really two news stories worthwhile considering today. The first is obviously the news story of the general who went to Iran, and the second is of the national scam, also known as the national dialogue. But before we get into the main stories of today, can I yet again remind you, if you haven't already, please subscribe to the channel. As you know, it really does help. Just click the bell icon, and there you go, you're subscribed. So let's get on to the main news stories. The first one is that General Rni, chief of the SANDF, went on an official trip to Iran, where he was reported to have expressed political alignment with Iran, obviously a US adversary. Now, he endorsed Iran's stance on Gaza, effectively positioning South Africa closer to Tehran's foreign policy rather than our own, and suggested military and political cooperation beyond what they currently have. His remarks were broadcast by Iran on their state media, which fueled diplomatic fallout. Now, we'll come to that diplomatic fallout in a moment, because it wasn't really much of a fallout at all. So, Cyril Ramaphosa was asked, what the hell do you make of this? And he said that apparently the general's foreign policy was not that of his own. He stated that foreign policy is the president's mandate, not the SANDF's. And he clarified that the president did not sanction the trip. Now, I must remind you that this happened once before to a certain Andrew Whitfield, where he went on an unsanctioned trip to the US and was fired because of it. So will this individual be fired? Well, we'll cover that in a second. Now, according to the defense minister, Andy, apparently the trip was authorized. So Cyril says it wasn't, but the defense minister says it was. Now, the president's spokesperson, Vincent, emphasized that the general's comments were ill-advised and politically inappropriate. So in other words, they're all trying to do forms of damage control. So what did the defense minister, Angie, do to help damage control? Well, she insisted that she saw nothing wrong with the general's comments, and she claimed that the invitation to go to Iran had been approved in 2024 and had simply been postponed, so it was not a new or rogue initiative as some have suggested. So she's saying that it was all just, it was all routine. She said that it was coincident that the trip coincided with the US-South Africa trade tariff negotiations whilst tensions are high with Washington. But you see, here's the problem. This directly contradicted what Cyril Ramaphosa, the president, said himself. And again, this shows that we have a cabinet that doesn't really know what the left and right hand are doing. Now, in typical fashion, the opposition parties have all jumped on board with the DA's leader, John Steenhuisen, saying that it was entirely inappropriate for a general to make political statements, and accused him of undermining delicate trade negotiations with the US. And some would say, yes, John, that's exactly what the ANC was attempting to do. Razan Zamzi's leader was the only one that had anything rational to say when he called for both the general and the defense ministers both to be sacked. He said that the army is already a mess with the worst audit outcomes of any department. But what this really is showing is that Ramaphosa has no grip of his cabinet. Effectively, what we've got here is you've got everybody just doing what they want to do. The president has no ability to coordinate any of this. He's just largely absent. So coming back then to the question of, will the general be fired? And the answer is no. Apparently, he's only 4 months from retirement. Sounds like an old 80s movie, to be honest. But apparently, the individual is likely to retire without sanction, and apparently he's going to escape punishment. They don't really want to take away his pension now. So, again, very weak Ramaphosa, because when this happened with Andrew Whitfield, he fired Andrew. But apparently that's not going to happen with the general. Yeah, that's kind of the ANC all over, isn't it? But doing all of this at the time when Pretoria is trying to reset relations with Trump and Washington just doesn't really seem a very smart approach, does it? Any perception of aligning with Iran will damage South Africa's negotiating position. And to sit there and say, well, you're leaning towards the US's adversaries is just like dumb. But nobody ever suggested that any of our ruling class in this country is anything but just simply retarded, because they are completely retarded. So let's move then on to the national scam, the complete bullshit that is. So the National Dialogue had its kickoff ceremony, and as you know, the entire idea behind it is that it would be a citizens-led initiative to unite the country behind a new social contract, address crises like unemployment, poverty, crime, gender violence, corruption, and inequality, and build a 30-year vision for South Africa through community-level dialogues aimed at reaching 10 million citizens with 13,500 ward-based sessions. Now, the inaugural National Convention was held at UNISA in Pretoria over 2 days, and Ramaphosa opened it with a lofty rhetoric: "We are gathered to listen to each other, to chart a common path forward." Now, the suggestion that they were all gathered there to do this citizen-led dialogue is kind of, well, bullshit, because apparently news came out that some participants demanded to be paid for their involvement. Their argument was that they were taking time away from their livelihoods and the government should compensate them. This sparked outrage from some who suggested that the National Dialogue was billed as a citizen-led movement meant to be voluntary. It added to the perception that the event was a pure political gravy train rather than a genuine grassroots process, with some critics arguing that it was yet again another example of state capture of civil initiatives where everything becomes transactional. That's how the ANC works. You can't get anybody to vote for you on legitimate means, don't worry, you just buy them off. So let's look at Cyril Ramaphosa's opening speech, because the opening speech was telling in terms of where this dialogue is going to go. And so Cyril Ramaphosa listed a series of big questions facing South Africa. Why do some people live in abject poverty while others live in opulence?
We also need to ask ourselves, why do so many people live in abject poverty and so few live lives of opulence?
Should be asking you that, billionaire Ramaphosa, who goes around in private jets, eating caviar. Yes. Why, Cyril, are you living in luxury whilst your people are not? Can you answer that for us, please, Cyril? He then said, why after decades of democracy are the prospects of a white child so much better than that of a black child? Is that so, Cyril? Have you seen any of the affirmative black action type stuff? Because that pretty much means that no white person's ever going to get a government job, ever. He said, why do women get paid less than men for the same work? Well, that's illegal, Cyril. There's a law against that. Can you stop taking WEF talking points? Why, when we have a Bill of Rights or LGBTQR plus whatever people still discriminated against? Are they? Because they have a whole month, Cyril. They have a whole month dedicated just to them. And they're pretty much a protected category in every Western country around the world. Maybe you should be asking that question of Iran, because Iran doesn't have a LGBTQ plus whatever month, do they? Why do traps run dry? Why do clinics run out of medicine? I don't know, Cyril. Why is it that every government department loots the fiscus dry and is unable to provide any form of service to anyone, ever? The irony, Cyril, is that you've been in government for over a decade. You were deputy president since 2014, and you were president since 2018. These are all questions we should be asking you. You don't ask us. We know the answer. The answer is that your people, your ANC, looted the state dry. In fact, you know this to be true, because you once told us that the ANC was accused number one in the eyes of the public. Because it is. So, what's your point? In case there was an individual who's apparently leading the entire national dialogue, a Janelle who in 2005 submitted a Masters of Science thesis at Stellenbosch University. This thesis was highly controversial because it involved studying convicted sex offenders at a prison. And in this thesis, she argued that we should attempt to normalize or rationalize child sexual abuse rather than condemn it. Now, this entire thesis has been doing the rounds on social media because everybody's looking at this saying, yeah, a person who's got a history of trying to intellectualize pedophilia and saying that we need to normalize it. This is the person leading the national dialogue, and we're meant to consider the national dialogue to be credible? So because of all of this, everybody's already starting to accuse the ANC of using the dialogue as a PR stunt. And let's be honest, the levels of mistrust and disgust that everybody's going to have of this national farce is going to be open for everybody to see. Now, because of that, the DA and the MK party have both withdrawn from the dialogue, saying that it was just another process of ANC electioneering dressed up as the dialogue, and they accused Cyril Ramaphosa of using state resources to bolster the ANC's 2026 campaign. And this is correct. But you see, many individuals weren't quiet about their dislike and distrust of the ANC at the event, and all of them were shut down and told to keep quiet. In fact, you can actually see that right here.
That's my appeal, colleagues. Thank you.
We thank you for your dialogue and continue the dialogue after lunch. Please, please, that's what we hear.
Colleagues, comrades, and friends, we will be back at 2:45. That is 14:45. Thank you so much.
Thank you, everyone.
Listen,
Have a good lunch.
the government has not kept its commitment. They are liars. They want you to go out so that we cannot address you on the crimes of the government. This government is...
As you know, many of the legacy foundations, Thabo Mbeki Foundation, Steve Biko Foundation, whatever else, they've all withdrawn from the dialogue themselves. In fact, the Thabo Mbeki Foundation wrote a scathing letter suggesting that it was misleading to brand it as the first citizen convention. They said some attendees cannot claim to represent constituencies and called it an unethical effort to mislead. And I'd agree, that's exactly what this is, an attempt to mislead the public. As you can see, many critics have described this as simply an ANC rally in disguise. ANC timekeepers controlled scheduling, delegates were addressed as comrades. Sessions where they openly chanted Amandla, VIP convoys, blacked-out SUVs, and constant protocol greetings made it feel like a state function and not a grassroots event. And that's because that's what this was. It was an ANC rally. But in any case, the Eminent Persons Group co-chair, that's actually a job title, conceded that the dialogue wouldn't provide all the answers immediately and described it as a fundamental step setting the agenda for the long road ahead, framing it as the revival of South Africa's history of dialogue. In other words, another form of Kudesa, 1994 elections, constitution, whatever else. And Sophia, an ANC steward, apparently defended it as a necessary process to build trust and confront issues like inequality and crime. Is that like, your government MPs that are apparently interfering in criminal investigations in KZN by any chance? Other voices, such as former presidents, have suggested that for this to be truly inclusive, you don't negotiate with friends, but with adversaries. So in other words, you can't go in there and basically tell all the people that have negative things to say about you to shut up. But that's the ANC's way. The ANC can't deal with criticism. The fact that he suggested that it could collapse if it was seen as partisan, and that's exactly how it's been seen. One day in, and everybody was like, political party. He even suggested that South Africa may need referendums on key issues and not endless dialogue, and to that I'd agree. But in any case, Cyril Ramaphosa framed it as a citizens-led initiative and necessary to heal the nation. Yes, heal the nation of 30 years of ANC rule, or should we call it misrule. That's really what's going on here, Cyril. But you don't want to admit to that, do you? This has led many critics to say that Cyril's been in power since 2018, and now he wants to ask the questions like, why do taps run dry? As if he isn't somehow responsible. He is the one responsible for this, but he doesn't want to take any form of accountability. The guy is simply useless, beyond all imagination. And for any individual to now look at Cyril Ramaphosa and think he has any form of credibility, you need your head checked. The guy is literally the worst president we have ever had. Jacob Zuma was better than this guy. In any case, that's just my views. Do let me know what you think in the comment section below. Until tomorrow, bye.